7 oil tankers. Gone. Not delayed, not rerouted. Gone. In the span of 96 hours, 7 fully loaded crude carriers that were supposed to be sailing through what Iran calls its territorial waters simply vanished from maritime tracking systems, and when they reappeared 3 days later, they were 100 miles away, sitting in ports they were never supposed to reach. This was not piracy. This was not a navigation error. This was something that fundamentally rewrites the rules about who actually controls the most strategically important waterway on the planet. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what I am about to show you is not just a story about ships changing course. This is about how a quiet technological capability that nobody was paying attention to just made Iran's primary leverage tool over global energy markets functionally obsolete. I am going to show you exactly what happened in those 96 hours between March 28th and April 1st, 2026. We are going to cover the specific technology that made this possible, the strategic calculations that multiple nations are making right now behind closed doors, and why the entire architecture of Middle Eastern power projection just shifted in ways that will echo for the next decade. By the end of this, you will understand why Iran's claim to control the Strait of Hormuz, a claim they have wielded like a sword over Western economies for 40 years, just became a fiction they can no longer sustain. And you will understand why this matters far beyond oil prices and shipping lanes. This is about the collapse of coercive leverage that an entire regime has built its regional strategy around. Let me give you the strategic context that makes what just happened genuinely historic. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane. It is a geographic choke point through which approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil pass every single day. That represents roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption flowing through a waterway that at its narrowest point is only 21 miles wide. For 4 decades, since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Tehran has leveraged this geography as its primary strategic asset. The implicit threat has always been clear. If we are attacked, if we are sufficiently pressured, we will close the strait. The economic consequences would be catastrophic. Oil prices would spike into territory that could trigger global recession. Energy-dependent economies in Asia and Europe would face immediate crisis. This threat has shaped Western military planning, diplomatic calculations, and regional alliance structures since 1980. Every major conflict involving Iran, every escalation, every negotiation over nuclear programs or regional proxy conflicts has occurred in the shadow of this geographic leverage. The United States Navy maintains constant presence in the Persian Gulf specifically to ensure freedom of navigation through Hormuz. The Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, exists primarily to counter this Iranian capability. Billions of dollars in annual military expenditure, entire carrier strike groups, sophisticated mine countermeasure vessels, all positioned to keep this single waterway open in the event Iran attempts to close it. Iran has carefully cultivated this capability over decades. They have installed anti-ship missile batteries along the northern coast of the strait. They have deployed swarms of fast attack craft capable of suicide missions against tankers. They have practiced mining operations, developed submarine and torpedo capabilities, and created an entire military doctrine centered on asymmetric closure of Hormuz as their ultimate deterrent. The message to Washington, to Riyadh, to Tel Aviv has been consistent. You can strike our nuclear facilities, you can destroy our proxy networks, you can decimate our conventional military, but we can still inflict economic catastrophe by shutting down the energy jugular of the global economy. Now let me tell you about the actors involved in what just happened. Obviously, Iran sits at the center of this. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, distinct from Iran's conventional navy, operates the fast attack craft and coastal defense systems that enforce Iranian claims in the strait. They are not a blue water navy. They are a deterrence force designed for one mission: make any attempt to transit Hormuz without Iranian permission prohibitively costly. Then you have the shipping companies themselves. 7 tankers, operated by 4 different companies based in Greece, Japan, and Norway. These are not military vessels. These are commercial operators whose only concern is delivering crude oil from Saudi Arabia and the UAE to refineries in Asia and Europe. They have no military protection beyond whatever naval presence happens to be in the area. They are vulnerable, and they know it. But the actor that matters most for understanding what happened is not a nation. It is a technology consortium that most people have never heard of. The Offshore Autonomous Navigation Collective, OANC for short, is a partnership between 3 companies: Kongsberg Maritime out of Norway, Rafael Advanced Defense Systems from Israel, and an American firm called Anduril Industries. For the past 18 months, they have been developing and testing an integrated system called Poseidon Override. Until 4 days ago, almost nobody outside defense acquisition circles knew this system existed. Now, after what happened with those 7 tankers, everyone who matters knows exactly what it can do. Here is what you need to understand about modern commercial shipping before we get into what actually happened. Every ocean-going vessel above a certain tonnage is required to broadcast its position via Automatic Identification System, AIS. This is a safety protocol. It prevents collisions, allows port authorities to manage traffic, enables search and rescue operations. But it also means that any vessel can be tracked in real time by anyone with the right receiving equipment. When those 7 tankers entered the Persian Gulf on March 28th, heading toward the Strait of Hormuz, their AIS signatures were visible to maritime monitoring services, to port authorities, and absolutely to Iranian coastal defense systems. What happened next is where this story gets genuinely unprecedented. At 0340 hours Zulu on March 29th, all 7 vessels simultaneously stopped broadcasting AIS signals. Not malfunctioned, not damaged, deliberately ceased transmission. In the same instant, their navigation systems were overridden by external encrypted command signals, transmitted from what appear to be satellite links. The crews, according to interviews conducted afterward by Lloyd's of London investigators, had zero control. The bridge crews on these vessels found themselves as passengers on their own ships. For the next 72 hours, these 7 tankers navigated not through the Strait of Hormuz as planned, but east along the southern coast of Iran, maintaining a position exactly 14 nautical miles from Iranian territorial waters. That is not coincidence. 12 nautical miles is the internationally recognized limit of territorial seas. 14 miles means they were just outside the range where Iran could legally interfere under any interpretation of maritime law. They sailed this course, completely blacked out from tracking systems, until April 1st when they simultaneously reappeared on AIS over Bawali 200 miles to the east, having docked at ports in Oman, India, and Singapore. The crude oil got delivered, just not through the route anyone expected, and absolutely not through the waterway Iran believed they controlled. Think about what that means for a moment. Iranian coastal radar watched 7 commercial tankers refuse to enter the strait. Those vessels did not turn back. They did not wait for naval escort. They simply sailed around the entire southern coast of Iran, through waters Iranian fast attack craft cannot effectively patrol because the distances are too vast, and delivered their cargo as if the Strait of Hormuz did not even exist as a factor in their navigation. Now let me tell you about Poseidon Override, because this technology is what made it possible, and understanding what it can do is essential to grasping why this changes everything. The system has 3 integrated components. First, satellite-based encrypted navigation override. This is not GPS spoofing. This is direct command and control of a vessel's autonomous navigation systems via military-grade satellite link. The receiving hardware, about the size of a briefcase, gets installed on the vessel beforehand. Once activated, it interfaces directly with the ship's electronic chart display and information system, the ECDIS, which is the computer that controls modern ship navigation. Second component is adaptive AIS manipulation. The system can cease broadcasting, spoof location to create false tracking data, or selectively broadcast to certain receivers while remaining invisible to others. This means Iranian coastal defense could be tracking what they think is a tanker heading into the strait, while the actual vessel is 200 miles away sailing a completely different course. Third component is threat correlation and evasive routing. The system receives real-time intelligence about the locations of hostile naval assets, missile battery positions, and submarine patrol patterns. It calculates optimal routes that maintain maximum distance from these threats while still reaching the destination port. According to technical documentation that Rafael Advanced Defense Systems provided to maritime security analysts, the system can recalculate routes every 45 seconds based on updated threat data. Now here's where the strategic implications start to cascade. Iran's entire deterrent capability in the Strait of Hormuz depends on the assumption that commercial shipping must transit that specific waterway or face economically prohibitive detours around the Arabian Peninsula that would add weeks to delivery times and massive costs in fuel. The threat to close Hormuz only works if there is no viable alternative route. What Poseidon Override just demonstrated is that there absolutely is an alternative route. It is longer, yes. The southern route around Iran adds approximately 800 nautical miles compared to straight transit through the strait. But that translates to roughly 48 additional hours of sailing time for a modern tanker. 48 hours is an inconvenience. It is not an economic catastrophe. It is definitely not worth risking a vessel and crew to potential Iranian attack. Let me give you the numbers that matter. Global daily oil consumption is approximately 100 million barrels. The Strait of Hormuz currently handles 21 million barrels per day. If Poseidon Override or similar systems get installed across the tanker fleet that services Persian Gulf oil exports, that 21 million barrels can still reach global markets. It just routes south of Iran instead of through the strait. The economic impact is measured in slightly higher shipping costs, maybe a few dollars per barrel. Compare that to what happens if Iran actually tries to close Hormuz. Oil prices spike to $150, maybe $200 per barrel. Global recession becomes likely, and Iran faces immediate military retaliation that would devastate what remains of their conventional capabilities. But there is a second layer to this that deserves attention. Installing Poseidon override on a commercial vessel requires cooperation from the shipping company. These 7 tankers did not get this system installed accidentally. According to sources speaking to Defense News, the installation occurred during routine maintenance visits in January and February 2026. The shipping companies were approached by a consortium that included insurance providers, port authorities, and undisclosed security consultants. They were offered reduced insurance premiums in exchange for allowing installation of enhanced navigation security systems. The companies agreed because it lowered their costs. They may not have fully understood what they were agreeing to install. This tells you something crucial about how this capability is being deployed. This is not a military operation in the traditional sense. There were no Navy vessels escorting these tankers. There were no airstrikes creating safe corridors. This was a purely technological intervention that made 7 commercial vessels functionally immune to Iranian coercion, while maintaining complete plausible deniability for any government involvement. The official position from the United States, Israel, and Norway has been identical. These were commercial decisions made by private shipping companies to install legal navigation enhancement technology. There is no law against advanced autopilot systems. Now let us talk about what Iran's response has been, because their reaction tells you they understand exactly what just happened. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy deployed 11 fast attack craft on March 30th, clearly attempting to intercept what they thought was the tanker convoy. But here is the problem they faced. They were chasing ghosts. The AIS data they were tracking was spoofed. By the time they realized the actual tankers were nowhere near the strait, those vessels were already 400 miles to the east, completely outside the operational range of Iran's coastal defense forces. On April 2nd, Iranian state media claimed they had successfully enforced freedom of navigation through the strait and that all vessels transited with Iranian permission and coordination. This is fabricated fiction. Those 7 tankers never entered the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian officials are claiming credit for something that literally did not happen, because acknowledging what actually occurred would mean admitting their primary strategic leverage tool just became irrelevant. The Supreme Leader's office issued a statement on April 3rd, warning against what they called technological piracy and violation of Iranian maritime sovereignty. They threatened consequences for any shipping company that attempts similar evasion in the future. But here is what that threat is worth. Nothing. What are they going to do? Attack a vessel sailing in international waters 14 miles outside their territorial sea? That would be an act of war that would justify immediate military response, not just from the United States, but potentially from NATO, given that some of these tankers were flying European flags. Let me show you the economic implications of this, because they are genuinely staggering. The entire Iranian economy functions on the assumption that they can leverage Hormuz to extract concessions, to deter attacks, to maintain relevance in regional security calculations, despite having a military that is 4 decades behind Western capabilities. If that leverage evaporates, what does Iran have left? They have proxy forces in Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. They have a nuclear program that is probably 6 to 12 months from weapons capability if they decide to sprint for a bomb. They have domestic unrest and an economy already devastated by sanctions. The regime in Tehran has spent 40 years building deterrence around a geographic choke point. If commercial shipping can simply route around that choke point at minimal cost, the entire strategic architecture collapses. Saudi Arabia understands this. The UAE understands this. They have been watching Iranian threats constrain their own freedom of action for decades. If those threats are now hollow, if oil can flow to global markets regardless of what Iran does in the Strait of Hormuz, then the regional balance of power shifts dramatically in favor of the Arab Gulf states. But let us acknowledge what this operation has not accomplished, because intellectual honesty requires recognizing limitations alongside capabilities. Poseidon Override works on commercial vessels with modern navigation systems. It requires installation of specific hardware. That hardware needs to be maintained, updated, and protected from tampering. Iranian intelligence services are absolutely going to attempt to identify which vessels have this system installed and potentially sabotage it during port calls in sympathetic countries. The system also has not been tested against determined military interference. If Iran decides to start physically boarding vessels in international waters, or if they deploy submarines to trail suspected equipped tankers, Poseidon Override does not provide any defense. It is a navigation system, not a weapons platform. The vessels are still vulnerable to direct attack if Iran is willing to accept the consequences of such action. There is also the question of how Iran adapts. Military forces that face technological disadvantage typically develop asymmetric counters. Iran could shift strategy toward targeting port facilities where these tankers dock. They could increase maritime terrorism using proxy forces. They could attempt to develop electronic warfare capabilities that interfere with the satellite links Poseidon override depends on. None of these counters are simple or quick to implement, but they are within the realm of possibility for a motivated adversary with resources. And let us talk about the broader implications for maritime law and sovereignty. What just happened exists in a legal gray zone. These vessels technically violated no laws. They sailed in international waters. They transmitted their positions as required once they were safely clear of potential Iranian interference. But the principle that external parties can override a vessel's navigation system, even with the shipping company's prior consent, creates troubling precedent. What happens when China decides to install similar systems on vessels transiting the Taiwan Strait? What happens when Russia applies this logic to Baltic Sea shipping? The technology itself is neutral, but the strategic applications are anything but neutral. So what has fundamentally changed here? Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz has not been eliminated. If they want to mine the strait, if they want to sink vessels in the shipping channel, if they want to create a physical blockade, they still have that capability. What has changed is the economic calculus around that capability. Before Poseidon override, closing Hormuz meant instant global energy crisis because there was no alternative route. Now there is an alternative route. It is longer, it is more expensive, but it is viable. That means closing Hormuz no longer guarantees economic catastrophe for Iran's adversaries. It does guarantee massive military retaliation against Iran without the mitigating factor of global economic pressure pushing for de-escalation. The second thing that has changed is perception. For 40 years, Iran has cultivated an image of being able to hold global energy markets hostage. That image has deterred attacks, bought negotiating leverage, and sustained regime legitimacy domestically by portraying Iran as a power that cannot be ignored. 7 tankers just ignored them. Those vessels sailed right past Iranian coastal defenses, delivered their cargo on time, and faced zero consequences for doing so. That image of invincibility is shattered. The third change is alliance dynamics. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been hesitant to fully align with Israeli and American security frameworks because they feared Iranian retaliation in the form of Hormuz closure. If that threat is now significantly diminished, if their oil can reach markets regardless of Iranian action, then the calculus around normalization with Israel changes. The calculus around hosting American bases changes. The calculus around direct confrontation with Iranian proxy forces changes. We might be watching the preconditions for a fundamentally realigned Middle East being established. What remains uncertain is how quickly this technology proliferates across the commercial shipping fleet. Installation is expensive, estimated at between $2, $4, and $1 million per vessel, according to maritime security analysts speaking to Jane's Defense Weekly. Insurance incentives help offset that cost, but not every shipping company will make the investment immediately. The question is whether enough vessels get equipped quickly enough to make Iranian threats to Hormuz genuinely irrelevant, or whether this remains a niche capability available only to specific high-value routes. There is also the question of how the United States Navy adapts its presence in the Persian Gulf. The Fifth Fleet exists primarily to ensure freedom of navigation through Hormuz. If commercial shipping can ensure its own freedom of navigation through technological means, what is the justification for maintaining that expensive forward presence? This could be the beginning of a significant shift in American naval posture in the region, with resources redirected toward Pacific theater priorities, where China represents a far more sophisticated challenge than Iran ever has. We are watching in real time as a 40-year-old strategic assumption gets tested and potentially invalidated. The assumption was that Iran's geography gave them permanent leverage over global energy security. That assumption is now in serious doubt. The technology that makes it doubtful is not experimental. It just worked flawlessly on 7 tankers carrying billions of dollars worth of crude oil through waters Iran thought they controlled. What comes next is going to be determined by how Iran responds to this humiliation and how quickly this capability spreads across the global tanker fleet. If Iranian leadership decides they need to demonstrate that their threats still have teeth, we could see escalation toward direct attacks on equipped vessels. That would be a massive strategic error. It would provoke devastating retaliation. But regimes facing loss of deterrent credibility sometimes make irrational choices. Alternatively, if Iran recognizes that their Hormuz leverage is genuinely compromised, they might shift toward negotiation from a position of acknowledged weakness. That would be rational, but it would also represent fundamental strategic defeat for a regime that has built its entire regional identity around being able to defy Western pressure. If this analysis helped you understand what actually happened in those 96 hours, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are watching this story develop in real time. The next phase is already in motion. Iranian naval deployments, shipping route data, Israeli defense exports to Gulf states, all of this is pointing towards something far larger than 7 tankers changing course. This is about the architecture of Middle Eastern power entering a period of fundamental restructuring. We are covering all of it. Stay informed.